So during the Memorial Day retreat that we had this past weekend, Venerable Children spoke quite a bit about cultivating love and compassion for people whose views are very different from ours. And I don't know about you, but I've always found this to be very, very difficult, especially because I have very strong attachment to my own views, because I identify with being intelligent and well educated, right? Therefore, my views are reasonable and right. And people who believe the opposite are not. Right, so today I wanted to share with you some of my own experiences connecting with people across the aisle, so to speak, when I was living and working in Singapore, and some of the impact that that had on my mind. So in my late teens and early 20s, I surrounded myself with artists and activists. I made friends with people who shared the same liberal views on social issues. For instance, that everyone should have a right to free speech, the government shouldn't detain people without trial, that we should abolish corporal punishment, especially the death penalty. People should not be discriminating against those in same-sex relationships, and migrant workers should be treated with dignity and protected by the law. And many of these views were not, probably still are not the norm in Singapore, but I created this universe for myself where these views were the norm. And the first time I had to step out of this bubble was not by choice. The Singapore government funded my education, so I had to fulfill a contract with them. And then as part of the contract, I had to attend this 3-month public policy course. So for 3 months, 8 hours a day, I had to talk to people with the opposite view. Or maybe, they just never questioned that these conservative views were the norm, right? So they held views that the death penalty and censorship are essential for national security. People in same-sex relationships and low-wage migrant workers with no skills are a threat to social stability, and so on. So I felt really upset in many of the discussions during the course, but often I was just too angry to express myself reasonably. And by the end of the course, I actually lost my voice, which I thought was metaphorical. But by that time, I had met the Dharma, thankfully, and about halfway through the course, I realized, maybe this is a great opportunity to practice, right? Because every single day, for 8 hours a day, here you are with the enemy, living with them, talking to them every single day. And that really helped me to start to shift my mind. So instead of focusing on what we didn't have in common, I started to just look at every person in the room as a human being, right? To see, maybe they're not so different from me, right? They want to be happy and they don't want to suffer. I really took time to think about how each person has good qualities, how they're kind to their parents, kind to their children, right? They have hobbies. They live full lives, and we care about the same country. It just happens that we have very different ideas about what that care looks like and whose voices we should pay attention to. So believe it or not, by the end of the 3 months, I actually did make some friends. And my mind had a little bit more space. Like, wow, it's possible to talk to people with different views and maybe even enjoy their company. And I think they probably thought the same thing about me, right? Like, who is this artsy-fartsy, liberal-minded, woolly person who can't think straight? That's probably how I came across. Bleeding heart liberal. And another big turning point for me was also working on a review of laws that protect foreign domestic workers in Singapore. And that took about a year. And for a very long time, some of the people that I put very firmly in the enemy category are employers of such workers who didn't give them a rest day every week because that wasn't required by law. So you can imagine these are workers who, work all year or more without any legal rest day. Or these employers who might verbally or physically abuse their workers. So bad people, right? And don't even talk about the agents who bring the workers into Singapore, right? And do really horrible things to exploit the poor and the vulnerable along the way, right? These are just privileged people who treat others like objects, nothing good to say about them. And that was my view. But at that time, the Labour Department was trying out this framework called design thinking. And the basic idea was that if you want to design a product or you want to change a system, you should start by empathizing with people who use the product who are in the system. And another idea about this framework was that if one person in the system experiences pain, actually everyone else in the system experiences pain at the same point. Yeah. So for instance, like if a product is not well designed and the packaging is very hard to deal with, the customer has trouble with the packaging, they call customer service and they yell at customer service, it hurts sales and so on, and the pain gets passed on within the system. So the idea was that if you can identify where people are in pain and address that, it actually benefits everyone who's involved. So as a part of this review, instead of just sitting in the office, they actually sent about 30 of us out to talk to people involved with foreign domestic workers. Everybody from the agents, employers, activists, and of course the workers themselves. And our job was just to listen. We paired up and just listen to people talk for at least an hour about their experience in relation to this issue. We had to listen to their feelings and needs, and we would come back and share the stories with each other. So, we started to understand the issue from a whole different perspective. And at a later stage of the review, the government actually held focus group discussions, and we deliberately brought people into the same circle who would never speak to each other. Yeah, so you had the agents, the employers, the activists, of course the government representatives all in the same room. And it was very tightly facilitated because there were definitely shouting matches at times. I have a long-standing memory of some activists yelling at the agent and my boss kind of backing up against the wall like, what are we gonna do? Yeah, because people felt so strongly about their stake in relationship to these workers. Yeah, but by the end of the process, to our great surprise, people really appreciated it. We got positive feedback all around. People just so appreciated being able to hear each other out, to actually understand what everyone else in the circle were concerned about. And even the activists who were constantly, trying to find fault with the government, getting them to improve, the activists themselves really enjoyed it and they wanted to hold more of such focus group discussions going forward. So that was really nice. And then around the same time, something happened in my own family. So one of the outcomes of the legal review was that we increased the penalties for employers who abuse their workers, right? Because the Singapore government, carrot and stick approach, right? Thinking if you make the stick harder, people are less likely to commit the offense. And then at that same time, my grandmother was starting to develop dementia. So she became convinced that the domestic worker helping her was going to poison her or trying to steal her curtains or everything else in the house. So she started to verbally abuse the worker. And my aunt was the legal employer, and my aunt was working most of the time, right? So she had no oversight over what was happening. And really, if the situation deteriorated, based on the new laws, my aunt might have wound up in jail or been fined. Yeah. And suddenly I realized that my grandmother was the enemy. So really, I think when we try and look at the situation from a bigger picture and just understand that every single person involved is just an ordinary sentient being, right, driven by ignorance and afflictions, just like me, just like ourselves, I found there was really no one to blame. There was no one that I could make an enemy. And I think the biggest lesson I learned from all this was that anger doesn't bring about social change and progress. At the end of the day, the anger just made me biased, and as long as I was holding on to my own self-righteous, morally upright point of view, I wasn't actually thinking about all the other people involved, and I couldn't think about how to benefit them. So as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, anger is old-fashioned. And genuine social change, I believe, really comes about by practicing compassion and humility. And just being able to set aside our judgments and our views about what we think is right and wrong, and take the time to listen to everybody involved, and instead put our energy and focus on what's causing pain and how to address it. Instead of saying, this is ideological, this is what my side believes, it's like, hey, there are people in pain. How do we address it? And let's instead put our energy on what we share in common and how to build upon that.